It is.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. This is, I think in the last 3 years, this is the first time we've had a joint planning commission and town council meeting. For those of you that are from the public, just so you know, this is a workshop training session, so we do not take questions or interact with those that are in the public. There is no official business that gets done at this meeting. This is strictly training for the two bodies. To review all the things that were in the, did you publish the agenda? Did the agenda get published?
There was no agenda for just put that the regular council meeting was canceled.
Okay, so the agenda is basically the timeline of the events that I see that this is concerning to you. If there are things that you would like to have addressed, I would suggest that you can email the town council, myself, the town manager directly about those things. And since you were here, if you say, hey, I was here, I will promise you that I will get back to you within 24 hours, like immediately. Okay. I apologize that we just can't conduct regular business during a training session. Okay. It's based on the notification.
It was just.
When is the next meeting?
Next meeting is September 5th. That is the Tuesday after Labor Day.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
And so without further ado, Sheila will take us through.
Sorry. You okay?
I'm good. I'm still standing.
Still standing.
I stand here, or there, doesn't matter, whatever, okay. Well, I'll stand for a while until Jeff pushes me down. So Jeff is gonna run the slides and then I'm gonna try to go through them. So the goal for tonight really is to try to get through this in 2 hours. There's a lot of information. But anytime you have a question, raise your hand, pop in, I don't care. We'll try to address it as we're going along. There is gonna be Q&A at the end, but if you have a question right then, go ahead and ask it, because this is gonna be an interactive working session. So tonight we're gonna talk about planning and land development. And then our goals, like I said, are the 2 hours. We're gonna learn about land use planning, why it's important, the elements of a comprehensive plan. We're gonna learn about your own land use regulations.
You have the packet.
Oh, yes, I do. Does anyone else need the packet?
So if this is being recorded, does somebody get the mic?
Yeah, we've got all of the mics setting out here, and they're all on, and we're gonna test to make sure that it's recording
Okay.
and can hear everyone speaking.
So Teams is picking up our voices
Yes.
as well as yours.
That is correct.
Oh, very good.
Cool.
Wow, look at those. I'm scared like that. 21 gun salute. All right, so then we talk about zoning and why each element's important, comprehensive planning, zoning, land use regulations. And then I'm gonna take you through your code, try to hit the highlights of each of the sections, and then that part's kind of gonna be the most tedious, but we'll go through it as fast as detailed as we can. So first, let's go into land use planning. What is it? It is when we bring, planning is a process through which we bring alternatives and identified, evaluated, and acted upon. And then the biggest part of land planning is community engagement. It's essential that we not only work with each other, but we work with others in the community who help us set the visions for our town. So what is it? We also have long-range planning. Long-range planning, as many of you know, is where you have your comprehensive planning. It's your visionary guiding documents. It's where you identify your community goals and objectives, master planning. The biggest part about your comp plan is it's your aspirations. This is where we want to be, and here's how we think we can get there. Current planning, most of you might know, is development review. So that's where you have your zoning and your regulations. These are your setbacks, your front yards, your height. You also have your subdivision regulations. You have subdivision design standards, and this is also where you have your enforcement. So what are the roles and responsibilities? We have elected officials. Some of you here were elected. So what do? You make policy, you legislate, you protect the public interest, and you provide direction. Then you have your appointed officials. Those are people that are appointed by your town council. They prepare the comprehensive plans. That's focused on your planning commission. They apply policy and regulations that the town council sets. They review development applications, regularly assess planning, policy, and regulation. Then you have your staff. Your staff are your technical experts. They're the ones that have gone to school and taken the classes, and then they provide you their expertise that way. They provide information, training, research, reports, and then they help apply those regulations. Next, you have your citizens. Citizens should have full participation. They should provide you advice. They live in your community. They're the ones that are electing you. They're the ones that are volunteering to go on these appointed boards. So they offer input as well as solutions because they know their neighborhoods. Lastly, you have your applicant. The applicant comes in, they're a property owner in most cases. They need to learn the regulations and the process. The key here is they expect a fair and predictable process. And that is how you get that, is by using your code and following your code. So if you treat everyone the same, there is a fair and predictable process. They communicate their concerns to you as part of their development process. That's right, go ahead. So where does land use planning start? It starts at your comprehensive plan where you decide where you want to go, what are your goals, your aspirations. Once you do that, you go and you amend your zoning regulations to help you get there. So after you update your comp plan, it's often common that you'll go into your land use regulations and change those so you can actually have the rules in place to implement your comp plan. Then you go into site design, development review, construction documents, building permits, and enforcement. So we're going to go through all of these, some of them more in depth, some of them more quickly. So let's start with the comprehensive plan. What is it again? It's a community vision, goals and objectives, growth management. How big do we want our town? How small do we want it? Land use decisions. Where do we want our industrial uses, our mixed uses? Grant funding. This is a helpful tool for you to identify what you want to apply for with grants. And then it also builds confidence and trust. If you have really good community engagement and people say, this is where we want to go, and you are actively working towards it, your community sees that you're listening to what they're saying. You usually evaluate your comp plan annually or 2 years, and then you re-adopt it every 5 to 8. So your plan was adopted in 2017. You're right on track. I know you got the grant to update it from DOLA, so you're right on track with getting it updated in that 5 to 8 years. So what is the use of a comprehensive plan? It guides your future vision. It informs land use and community development decisions. So whenever you have a rezoning come in, you compare it to your comp plan. Does it meet our land use plan? Does it meet the criteria of that business commercial district? It also helps with your capital improvement funding. So if you're looking to, if you have a trails section or a trails master plan, and you're looking at your capital improvements program, you can identify this is priority 1. So this is the year we want to do this trail. Maybe next year we'll do that trail. So it helps you with your capital improvement planning. It helps align your budget process with the long-term goals. It also can be used for additional grant funding. So if you're looking to implement some kind of housing program and you want to seek a grant for it, you can go back to your comprehensive plan and say, we have buy-in from our city and our town and our citizens to do this. So it helps you with your grant applications. So why do we have comp plans? Colorado revised statutes require one, and it's your planning commission that's legally responsible for preparing and adopting the comp plan. Even though they prepare and adopt it, it's often sent up to the higher body, whether it's Board of County Commissioners, Board of Trustees, or Town Council, to also adopt it as well. Comp plans are typically adopted by resolution and not ordinance because they're a guiding document. If you adopt them by ordinance, they become a law and you have to do what's in them. So there's a key there too. What are the required, sorry.
You know of municipalities that have codified their comp plan into law in Colorado?
In Colorado, I don't off the top of my head, do you?
You can do it though.
You can.
Well, I assume that we could because she just said we could. I just want to know if you know of any.
I know there are, but I don't know who.
It requires a public hearing to do it.
Yeah, with some of my clients, we've gone back and made them not binding. So town of Gypsum, town of Goshen Springs, I think both those jurisdictions at one point, they were binding and we backed it up. So no, they're just a guidance document.
Thank you.
There are some times that you want it to be binding, but for instance, if your land use is one thing and the rezoning is another, they would have to amend the land use and amend it. That's not a bad thing, but there are other elements of your comp plan that are so aspirational, it's kind of hard to make them, you know, legally, how do you justify that? How do you really interpret what that is? So here's what, according to the revised statutes, what you have to have in your comprehensive plan. Public places, sites, facilities, location and extent of water supply, location, character, and extent of public infrastructure, zoning, land use plan, population growth and housing needs, geological hazards and constraints, and recreation and tourism. So all of these have to be within your comp plan. The one you have now has all of that. Some of them, those sections are smaller than others. You could go to larger towns where there's complete sub area plans for each of these. So it depends on how in depth you want to go for each of them. So now I'm gonna let Jeff do a little presentation on the current comprehensive plan.
And I won't make it all those slides you have. Key highlights. It's developed in 2017. As you all know, it's adopted in February 8th, 2017. Last amendment was June 5th of 2023, when we amended the 3-mile plan. Table of contents, you've seen this slide before, but it's basically these 6 chapters. The 4 that matter the most are 2, 4, 5, and 6. Just so you know, like, this is your vision, your values, and viewpoints, right? So that's coming from chapter 2. This is really input that came from all of the community engagement that occurred during the last comprehensive plan. And what it does is it starts to color what all you are aspirationally desiring in your comp plan. And it gives kind of a baseline notion of what those aspirations are. Next 2 big components to it are your 3-mile annexation plan and your future land use map. And your 3-mile plan tells you where do you want to grow along your perimeter, how far you want to move out. And then your future land use map, it tells you how do you want to grow, how do you want that growth to look, and how do you want it to feel. So character. The other chapter 5, this kind of breaks down into intent, opportunities, and policy. These are your 7 plan elements. The first piece is really good tools for development applications that are coming in, and it's a quick tool for you to look at, okay, is this in a spot where we're looking to grow? And then are they proposing something that kind of gets into what culturally and character-wise, what we were aspiring for and what we were think would happen in that area? The 7 plan elements kind of takes it further, and it helps you create a new lens that allows you to look at applications that maybe weren't what you expected to happen. Market changes, things evolve, what becomes new innovative ideas about land use or businesses comes into play. And so then we have these 7 elements that we can lay on top of that and ask ourselves, well, this doesn't match what we were thinking in the 3-mile plan, doesn't really match what we were saying in the, future land use map, but, can we put these different layers in, and are they still trying to get some aspirational major policies that we want for the town? 5 action steps. Those are the 5 action steps. So this is coming from chapter 6. Your comp plan has 5 of those. And it's really asking what are the big ideas that the town can do over the next 5 to 10 years. And to what Sheila was talking about earlier, this feeds into your capital improvements budget. It feeds into how you manage your yearly budget year after year. And this is a good litmus test every year when you're doing those reviews, 1 and 2, to say, are we even making progress on these 5 major things? This is a simple list. I've seen comprehensive plans where they're much more extensive lists of implementation strategies and goals that you have. Yes, ma'am.
These you pulled out of our comp plan.
Yes, I did.
So action item or action number 3
Yeah.
is actually listed there.
What's that?
Action 3 is listed in the comp plan.
Yes, it is. It's in chapter 6.
Okay.
Generally consistent. I'm not going to belabor this. We talked about it. How do we apply the comprehensive plan to review proposed applications? This is what we came up with, but with the new comprehensive plan that we get to move forward with, we can begin to think about, to your point of, can we codify this? Can we make this more something that we can quantify and be a little bit more clear about, does this comp plan or this application meet what's being asked of in the comp?
So can I,
That's something that could be explored.
before you go, can I make a comment or a question?
Absolutely.
Okay, so since all of this planning is highly subjective.
Yeah.
And since these plans, so landowners can come in and put a PUD in place, for example, and ask for a certain thing. And it ends up going through the process and ends up getting approved. And then there's one project, and that one project doesn't make a big impact because it's one project. And then another project comes in and it's changed and it makes a different impact. And cumulatively, it seems to me that we have drifted pretty far away from the comprehensive plan guidelines. And so at some point, you gotta kind of like rein it back in, right? And which hopefully the new comp plan will do. But then we need to make the municipal code more enforcement in the municipal code to line up with the comprehensive plan.
Absolutely. So one thing that I don't think that's been happening for you all in the time of the last comprehensive plan is there hasn't been a review and a revisit of the comp plan on a yearly to 2-year basis to see if we're staying on course or if we're drifting off into the other direction. And those 1 to 2 year check-ins allow you to course correct and possibly amend the comp plan as it is, because maybe you saw something that you didn't expect before, but you like what came through and you want to see more of that, but you want it to be reflected in your comp plan. Those are my thoughts. Sheila.
No, and I agree with you. I just think we need to do, we need to have some self-correction and we need to have, like you said, review, because we've drifted away considerably and it's pretty obvious to me.
Some comp plans even have like punch list items that you can kind of keep going down to see if you're keeping track of those as well.
Yeah, and that gets to the action items of the 5, but then in some comp plans can be a more robust implementation plan.
Something else some cities do is, and Jeff is well aware of this because he's had to do a few in the past, is they require you to update your land use plan. So if you do deviate from the recommendations of your future land use plan, the applicant has to make a application to do that along with the rezoning. So you amend the map and the zoning at the same time. So you're massaging your comp plan as you move forward. So you're acknowledging that we think this is a better land use and we're going to go ahead and rechange the zoning, but we're going to take the land use plan at the same time.
And I want to ask Bob this, maybe is it possible, instead of codifying the entire comp plan, is it possible to codify, say, the flume? And have that be one thing that can be an amendment piece that's asked of applicants as they move forward. Okay. That's one way to add both.
Right.
No, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
I like that a lot.
And you can modify the requirement to consider cumulative effects. A lot of environmental regulations at the federal level require an analysis of cumulative effects, even within a regional area, geographic area, or over a period of time, and in some cases both. So that's one way to approach it. And that's what you want to do. That would go into your land use.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's great.
Okay, pass the mic back off to Sheila.
So some of these we're going to fly through because they might be duplicate, but when you're reviewing development, step 1, you want to find substantial compliance with the future land use plan. And step 2 is a finding of consistency with the adopted policies. So whenever you're looking at any review or application before you, those are the 2 things that the planning commission focuses on because that's their charge of the planning commission. But it doesn't hurt for you to also do it as the council.
Not to put anybody in the spot, but I know that the term substantial compliance is also a question mark for some, like the general consistency. I don't know if anybody wanted to ask a question at this point about that.
Well, but our code, which supersedes the plan, right, says conformance. So how does that factor into the decision-making process? Because conformance could mean exactly, right?
There's substantial compliance and then there's general consistency.
Right, but in the code, it says conformance when it talks
So
about,
this is your guiding document.
right,
Your other is your regulatory. So with that one, it's your law saying general conformance. Your guiding document is saying substantial compliance. So
yeah. And then doesn't say general conformance, it just says conformance,
conformance.
right?
And in some cases, just generally consistent.
So there needs to be some form of ranking mechanism that determines what language you're going to use, right? It's too vague. I know it's a guiding document, but you can go all over the place with terms like substantial compliance, general conformance. You can poke holes in it all over the place. And it's your subjective opinion. So when you're there going through these things and creating your presentations for planning commission and council, you use that language and we're all on the hook to guess what you mean by it. And I don't want to guess. I want to know if you think this thing is compliant and say, without a doubt, this meets the criteria 7 out of 10 times, right?
Absolutely, Mayor. Yes. The language comes from the code. So it's not coming necessarily from the mouth of staff. It's just coming from code. And staff is doing their best to meet your expectation, which is what we want to do, but also meet what code says.
So the code says you have to use certain language.
We're just repeating code because that's the law. That's the word of the law.
So,
Right, but in the code, it says conformance, and that's where
That's what.
that's where we have a disconnect between the guiding document that talks about general compliance and all that stuff, but the actual municipal code says conformance.
So our goal would be to have consistent terminology
Correct.
and have terminology that we have a clear meaning.
Correct.
And I think we all acknowledge that we've got a softness on both those issues right now.
Right, yeah.
How about that?
so I'll stop blaming you.
Agreed. And the other issue too is.
So how
I will do whatever you like.
No, I understand now. I didn't realize that there was this, you were taking this specifically from the code. So now I get it and I'll just keep my mouth quiet and know that it's not you making these terms up out of the.
Well, I think,
Mayor, the last thing I want you to do is be quiet.
Oh, wait a minute. Do we-
We're gonna- We need to do it.
No voting going on.
You know what Stephen said about me.
one of the things that we get tied up in the planning commission, when it comes over to us, obviously, the staff is gonna tell us, we concur with this or we recommend. Now, when we look at it, we're looking at it on behalf of the public, and the public doesn't see the code. They're looking at it on how they're gonna affect it and using that fourth stage of the public and what the public opinion is. So even though they're meeting that requirement for what code is saying, again, we understand the obligation that you have to go ahead and lock it in to meet, they have met the requirement, understood, however, X. You can't arbitrarily say that you agree or disagree. You just put the terms into the document stating that they have met that requirement.
At one point, we were using the terminology recommending.
Yep.
Now we merely say, does it meet code or not?
Perfect. And that's,
Leave that for, and then we leave it up for you all to decide and discuss. And that's why there are motions of condition or deny or approve. That's all in the power of you as the two diocese.
perfect. Yep. No, I just want to make sure that that's clear that, yes.
Yeah, I like how if they're going to say it's compliant or not,
Yes, sir.
it's the planning commission that should be making a recommendation.
Yes, sir.
And then the council determining whether or not we're gonna comply with that.
Correct. And before it was this, we recommend, and we were sort of stuck in that pickle of,
We made that change based on some research.
Yes, sir.
I talked to some of y'all in the room, some of your, opinions and stuff like that. We did some research with some other towns and they're doing the same thing. The county staff never recommends.
yes,
So
sir.
you look at the county, they never make recommendations. They just present the case. They tell what percentage it complies and stuff like that. No recommendation. So I think it's better when the staff takes them off the hook. It doesn't look like they're, for or against the case or anything.
Who's paying you?
Yeah, nothing. I think that change made nothing but a lot of changes to make it well forward.
The only other thing I will say about a comprehensive plan is you could have two people read the same sentence and interpret it differently.
Sure.
So there's always gonna be that issue with comprehensive planning, even your regulations. You can have two lawyers read the same thing and interpret it differently, so that will be their bonus to all raise to it.
That's why you have to lawyer.
Terminology and how it's seen in the planning changes over time too. So what was written a certain way that meant a certain intent in that year that the thing was written, may have a totally different reading when you read it 3 or 4 years later.
Yeah. We're not gonna go through this again, but we all seen the future land use plan. These are the designations.
Instead of them.
We have an urban growth area, so As you can see, the hatched areas are the places where you've annexed within your urban growth area. But this was really what you identified as the areas that you wanted to grow into. And then you have your criteria to do them. And then we've already talked about the 7 elements of the plan. So now we're going to jump into legal framework. And so this is your authority to be able to regulate land. So it came from the Standard Zoning Enabling Act of 1924. I had to learn about that in college. It was so much fun. Let me tell you. Title 29, Article 20, Part 1 of the Local Government Land Use Control Enabling Act is from this area. With also the federal laws, you also have to look into the constitutional considerations, freedom of speech. Let's turn to signs, freedom of assembly, due process takings. And then later on this afternoon or this evening, sorry, we're going to let Bob talk more about the quasi judicial and ex parte communication. So what can be regulated? Land uses, the location and extent of those land uses. In other words, where you want those uses to be and how much of it you can build upon. Lot area, lot coverage, setbacks, building height, size, floor area ratio, access, site layout, landscaping, parking, subdivision, which is the creation and consolidation of property, the layouts of lots, blocks, roads, utilities, infrastructure improvements, architectural design, review, and approval procedures. So those are all the things that you can regulate within your code. What are the elements of land use regulations? You have your administrative, which is where you have your general administration. You look at non-conforming uses and structures and your enforcement. Then you have your procedures. How are we going to process all these applications? What are your submittal requirements? And again, on the non-conforming uses and structures, what is the process by which they can stay or they have to go away? And then finally, your standards, which is the part that most of you see all the time, which is what are your zone districts? What are the dimensional standards within each of those? The use standards, non-conforming uses and structures. Again, do they get to expand? Do they get to expand? Can they be more intense? Can they be less intense? So monuments land use, we have 2. We have a comprehensive plan, and then you have Title 8 being the land development code.
One's aspirational, one is code, one is law.
All right, so I'm going to jump into annexation. So some communities have, and you have annexation that is regulated by the statutes. In your code, in some codes, they go ahead and add additional things to regulate. Your code does not. The only thing that your code speaks to about annexation is 1803-130, the zoning of annexed land. The only other exception is in the Planning Commission bylaws, which are referenced in your code. And that requires them to make a recommendation on annexations to the town council based on conformity with the comprehensive plan. And it must be generally in the best interest of the town of Monument. So if you recall the last couple of annexations, you had Planning Commission specifically made recommendations on those 2 items because the bylaws require it. And then brought it to you, and then you review it based on what the statutes require as far as, first of all, whether or not you want it, which you can say yes or no. But if during the process, we met all of the check all the boxes, the ones that contiguity, the public notice, all of those things.
To answer the question here.
Mhm.
Based on the annexation, and I'm just gonna make a comment, and it may not be something that can be discussed here. But with this one that we just recently went through. Town got locked out because the applicant came in with a particular PUD and it all got changed and totally took everything out of our hands. How does that happen, or how can that be avoided? It seems to me, I mean, when applicants come in and say, we want to annex and we want to purpose this conversation of PUD, why does it get changed before it comes to the planning commission and to the council, where there's a certain level of control that totally got lost the last time?
We're going to talk about that more in depth later.
Okay.
I'm going to say Bob is, but the history I know on that specific one, when as part of your development review process, we have pre-application meetings where developers come in and meet, and they meet with staff to get a general guidance on What does your land use plan show? What do you think the town might support? Does this make sense based on what your comprehensive plan says and what your zoning says? Based on that input, staff made a recommendation. That's how it got changed in that instance. That's the history I know. It wasn't me, but that's the history I know that happened. But that happens a lot in almost any application. Staff meets with them first. We talk them through like the future land use plan, the comp plan, here are the things they say. We can even say like, have you watched any of your town council meetings previously? They don't like this use. You might want to consider that. We as staff can say that.
And we have,
Elected and appointed officials, you kind of can't, depending on where they are in that process. So that's the guidance that is given during a pre-application, whether it's good or bad, whether it turns out to be the right advice or not, but that's where that probably happens.
But could I kind of attach on to that? I think the problem is we're given a future land use map, and in this case, it was mixed use, which I guess zoning would be PUD. And yet, when it came to us, it was something totally different. And it way different, not even similar. And I guess they don't, you know, I suppose staff wouldn't go back and say, well, if you want something that different, you need to come to council and try to change the future land use map. So the future land use map is a soft recommendation. And that's a question.
It's a guiding document, so it's not legislated. It's not the rule. Your zoning map is the rule. Your future land use plan is the guiding document. So yeah, that if that process was built into your code now, that to change the land use plan, you have to go through that process, it would have been a good one. In this case, it was an applicant who was firm. This is what I want. I'm not going to deviate. So it was a decision of, do you want them in the town or do you not? And that they weren't going to budge in that case. So it was one of those, you're kind of stuck.
I guess what I got frustrated about was they weren't going to budge after they got advice that took us out of the process.
Yes.
And that's what I'm saying is, in future annexations, how do we avoid that so that we hopefully,
That is,
that should have been annexed. We wanted it and
so that is part of that previous process of the roles. So your council sets your policy. Your staff and your planning commission need to listen and follow that. So if history, you follow the history of the actions. And when those people come in, your staff says, you may want that, but if you look at the past history of the last year, that hasn't happened. So I wouldn't suggest moving forward with it. So you have to have a staff who listens and pays attention to what the decisions are and the policies are to move it forward.
which means they don't make recommendations that gives them.
Yeah.
I'm not attacking you.
It's okay, go ahead. That's what your staff should be doing. Your staff should be listening and paying attention to the comments, the suggestions, and then helping guide those applicants to, that's not what our town wants, based on what our comp plan says, what our planning commission's recommendations are, what our town council recommendations are on all the applications that have been before them. So they may have the right, they may have a zoning that's straight zoning, multifamily, but your staff should still say, would you consider something else? Because that's really not what they want here. Or would you be willing to compromise on these things? So that's the guidance that they should be giving before it gets to you. Okay, so we'll move on from annexation, but I'll talk about it a lot more later. Okay, so we're gonna go by the land development code. This part's gonna be fun. I'm gonna try to really just hit on highlights of some of these and focus on the main ones. So the first one I'll go into is you have your purpose and applicability. So you have general provisions, chapter 1801, purpose and applicability, article 1. Interpretations, I wanted to jump to that one. So the key here is your standards or your minimums. So we often have that question is, okay, you have to have 2 parking spaces. Well, is that the maximum number you can have? No, it's the minimum number you have to have. Can you have more? Yeah, if you can fit it in and meet everything else. So always remember, those are the minimums, they're not the maximums. I know that came up, I think, back with the industrial standards with the parking and loading or something. But these are minimum standards, not maximum. The other thing is the most restrictive applies. So that applies not only within Title 18, but within all of your ordinances. So if you have let's say the chapter on water has that an easement has to be 5 feet, but the development code says it has to be 6. We require 6 because the most restrictive applies. We even have conflicts within Title 18 where I believe the one was the final plat. The chart said a final plat was only a public hearing at planning commission and not at council. But if you read further down in one of the paragraphs, it said it was a public hearing at both, which is why they're now public hearings at both. So it's the most restrictive applies. So if you ever see a conflict, always know that the most restrictive between those two apply.
The ordinance for that will be coming out once again.
So within any zoning regulation, if you ever update this, there's always an effective date, and then there's a chapter on how to handle cases that are in process. Or you usually give people the ability to come in under the new code, even though it's not adopted yet, so that they don't get caught in that process. But you'll always see that in a code as well. Severability, that means if you find something in your code, like one sentence, one word that is unconstitutional, it doesn't nullify the whole thing. You can just pull that one word out. Violations. So violations of our code, they're misdemeanors. There's fines, but no imprisonment. Each day is a separate offense. Permits or approvals in error. So if your staff made a wrong and error and approved a permit, it's null and void. Even though they made it by mistake, the code says it's null and void. So there is that in there to cover you. And then the director, the planning director or other duly appointed town officer is charged with the enforcement. So we have code enforcement and you have your planning director. They are in charge of enforcing the code whenever something is wrong.
Question. How do we get to imprisonment? For violations.
It's code.
Change code. So people who are habitual offenders of our town codes, we can do the fines. And then we can get to the point where we'll be in prison. And can we take their land too?
Depends on the magnitude of the violation, that kind of penalty,
Well, you know what I'm talking about.
I'm not sure.
Well, we have someone who, despite their plat, their approved plat, scraped their land and changed the drainage, and then killed all the trees. And it was on their plat that they were not allowed to do either of those things.
So we can't answer that off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But
There's a slide later, there's some homework in between.
I do believe that there's recourse that we have under the code currently, and if it's not sufficient, we could add one. But in general, if there's a violation that changes the use of land, changes the conditions of the land, you can hold the landowner responsible for putting back into the condition that it should be. And there's a bunch of different ways to get there, including nuisance theories and the like, but,
Even if it's, so we can go through and change these things, but it's happened already. So can it be applied to something that's previously happened?
yeah, so generally laws you can't apply to previous events.
Right.
But I suspect there's probably enough avenue in your code that we could address the situation you just described in some fashion.
You heard that, Mike? Urgent.
The next section would be the amendments. So amendments to the code can be initiated by staff, planning commission, or council. The general public cannot. Typically, though, if you have the general public bring up an issue to staff, staff will bring it to you if we think it's something that really needs to be addressed. Administration and procedures. We're going to talk about compliance. You can't build anything or sell anything unless it's in compliance. So in other words, you can't take your property, write a deed that splits it in half and sell half to your neighbor and keep half. Then it's not a legal lot. Therefore, we don't have to issue permits for it. No permits if the town is owed money. So if we have some unpaid bills, we as staff don't have to issue permits and you don't have to do any approvals on those either. The director can issue early grading permits. I know this has come up, but it does say if it's unusual circumstances, and one of those that does allow is if the grading is needed for public infrastructure. So early grading permits are pretty common, but I know there's been some concerns with those lately. We don't issue COs until landscaping, the required private improvements or other amenities are in place. So you can do a phased approval. So when you have, let's say, an apartment complex, if you want to do it for building one, if they have all the parking in and the landscaping around that, or maybe it's the wrong season to put in landscaping, you can do phased COs. And how we handle that is by doing surety, which I will talk about later. And then whenever our code is silent on things, they do have references to other documents within our code, such as the City of Colorado Springs Engineering Division standards and specifications, drainage criteria manuals, public health and environment. So we have a bunch of other books that we can look at. One of them that is getting updated is the City of Colorado Springs is updating theirs. They're doing it in sections. So that's something that you're going to want to keep an eye on so that you can stay with the most current version. It is good to have very similar so that your streets match up, because the county and the city run into that all the time, that they have different standards, all this stuff doesn't match up. So trying to make sure that they do is always really helpful. Any questions on that?
What's that document?
Which one? The one that's getting updated is the engineering division standard and specifications. The one thing you'll want to think about is whether you want to adopt it after it's all done, or if you want to adopt it piecemeal as they go through them and adopt it themselves.
We currently have a traffic manual and criteria that we've had since, I think it's been updated since 2022. So that is what we lean on.
The roadway design and technical criteria manual.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You have that memorized.
Yeah, we should stay current with Colorado Springs because they're doing all the legwork.
Yeah. It is.
That's why I was taking notes,
Yeah.
right? Just whether we want to piecemeal it as they update or wait until it's final, but yeah. Let them spend the money to do it.
The other thing in this section that's important is the Tri-View Metropolitan District, because they do a lot of their own design standards. Where there's a conflict between Tri-View standards and town standards, again, more restrictive, stringent applies.
We could require Tri-View to do Colorado Springs standards if we're on those standards, correct?
No, I could, I believe that our standard, because we own the road, it needs to meet our town standard. But then Tri-View maintains it, right? So, that is something that we typically try to do, is make sure that it meets our code.
Another topic that's being discussed now too.
On certain roads, yes,
Yes.
that is correct.
Yes. They can have a more restrictive standard, but it would have to meet our minimum standard, correct?
Yeah.
That's correct. In our code, it points to the criteria manual. It says it shall meet the criteria manual. And in the criteria manual, it says it shall be these standards. In many cases.
A good example is when Tri-View expanded Jackson Creek Parkway. Tri-View worked hand in hand with Monument so that, because again, Monument owns the roads.
Right.
So the whole planning piece was done hand in hand with Monument because, in fact, if I remember correctly, Tri-View had to lean on Monument to make sure that, I forget who was the fiber people, that the fiber company that was laying fiber. They, I forget who was putting it fiber along Jackson Creek. They were putting it right on the edge and we're like, we're gonna plow right over it. And initially they told Tri-View to pound sand. So Tri-View went to Monument and said, hey, Monument.
We is Monument.
Yeah. Well, you're talking past tense. So Jim McGrady had to go to Monument saying, can you help us out here, have them move it, because Tri-View is about to put an expanded road. Is it Martinez?
Yes.
Yeah, Tom Martinez, yeah. He was hand in hand with that whole process.
Okay.
So.
Good.
Sometimes it works.
Sometimes.
So just in that scenario, so you understand, we're not telling Tri-View what the standards have to be. They operate kind of independent of that. We say, for you to build a road within the town, you gotta do it to this standard. And then whoever's building the road, if they're getting something for Tri-View, they go to Tri-View and Tri-View says, if you want whatever, you have to build it to these standards. And so they end up having to do it to the most restrictive, the most burdensome, the most beneficial to the public. But it's not that we're imposing town requirements or try to do it in that case. We're imposing them on the person building the road that's gonna dedicate it to the town.
Right.
Okay, so the next one is the review process. So this one I'm going to take you through kind of quickly. Before anything is distributed to anyone, we make sure it's a complete application. Planning Commission and Council shall consider all the evidence presented by the applicant and other interested parties, comments of review agencies, recommendations of town staff, and comments from the public. The Planning Commission has a 30-day time limit by which they review it, and then it has to go to council. Then the council has to act within 45 days. Now, a lot of this is, we build it into the public notice. It always seems to make itself work out. The only time it wouldn't is if the Planning Commission tabled something, but that would be an action. So they did take an action within that 30 days. The director has the authority to review and render administrative decisions. The director shall approve with conditions, or deny. The same with Planning Commission and Council. You as bodies can request additional examinations, tests, plans, studies. You can request site visits. So if you ever have a project and you don't think there's enough information on a specific thing, you can request those. Your code allows you to do that. The applicants must pay all the fees. And again, if they don't pay them, you don't have to approve anything. And then there is a table 1.1 that if you ever want to know what the specific process is for every application, it highlights it. It talks about if they have to do a pre-application, complete list review, referral agencies, and then which body and type of approval is done. So does it just go to Planning Commission? Does it go to both boards? Does it go to the Board of Adjustment, or is it administrative? So pre-application, we talked about that a few minutes ago. Before somebody goes in to make application, they meet with staff first. Staff will do meeting minutes. They will give them the checklist of all the things they have to do, give them a general time frame of how long it will take them to go through that process. Then once the application comes in, we do a determination of completeness. Now, we're not going to review the plat to make sure everything is there, but we're going to go down that checklist and make sure they do have everything, and everything else. The north arrow may be in the wrong direction, but they have a north arrow. We're going to catch that on the review. So the completeness is just to make sure there's enough information in there to actually do it. Then we refer it out to referral agencies. Who are they? School districts, utility providers, fire departments, metro districts, anyone who would have an interest within that project. We also, I keep saying we, it's not me anymore. There's development review team meetings, and that's where staff organizes everybody that we refer it out to into one meeting so that they can all talk amongst themselves about a project. Fire may say one thing that conflicts with what utilities does or wants, and so they can hash it out during that meeting, and that happens as needed.
As needed right now.
Yeah.
It's intended to be once a month, if not every 2 weeks. We're doing it as needed for the time being.
So you'll see later, we kind of go through that cycle as much as possible until the project is deemed ready for public hearing. Some communities send the application to you with a list of 500 conditions. I mean, I haven't seen 530 sometimes, but you need to correct the north arrow. You need to correct this table. The goal in Monument is to get you a completed project. So you're looking at what they actually want to do, and you're not focusing on something that might change between Planning Commission and Council or after Council approval. The goal is to have you see the final product, and so you know what you're acting upon. When it's ready, we also do public notice. So 15 days prior to the public hearing.
Stat.
Yes, stat. I'm going to say that.
There's no we.
There's no. Before the hearing, not a meeting, and I'm going to have Bob talk about the difference between a hearing and a meeting later. We do notice by mail to property owners within 500 feet. They post it on the property, and then it's published in the paper. I know there's been some discussion about possibly changing that to the website, but currently right now it would either go into the Gazette or the Tribune. There is a provision in the code as well that we noticed at one point about requiring mailings to be done prior to application.
It's true.
And we don't know if that has ever been done or implemented, but it's in the code that you should mail your neighbors before the application is submitted. Other options are to have neighborhood meetings. Those aren't required, but the director can say you need to do one. And then part of the notice is we can combine, the town can combine Planning Commission and Town Council notices together. which is what is done because it does save money. So we do, there's one mailing, one notice in the paper. The only time that changes is if there's some kind of change in the public hearing, the planning commission might table it, so therefore we have to modify the council one or just open it and close it
And then sign post.
and sign posting, yeah.
So the neighborhood meetings, that was sort of set by several members of the board back when Connexus was a thing. If it's not currently a requirement, then we'll have to make assuming an ordinance or a resolution, I don't know, but I would prefer, and I don't know how everybody else feels, but I would prefer that applicants are mandated to have neighborhood meetings but during the pre-application, application processing stages, somewhere in there that it makes sense so that neighbors are aware. And we're gonna have to figure out the criteria because in some cases, these developments, when you hit the 500-foot mark, there's still nobody there, right? And it's quite expensive to do those anyway. I know because I did one.
Mhm.
And, but if it's not a requirement today, then Bob, we need to create the language to make it a requirement that developers will go to the adjacent neighborhoods, providing that, of course, we vote on it and.
I would be sure to set some criteria.
Yeah.
Because there may be instances where it's the onerous for everyone to have a neighbor, try to set up a neighborhood meeting when it's a smaller development or it's a amendment on something that's already been approved. So I would say new applications, things like that, but set some criteria for it.
And no, sorry, I would say also distance. I think 500 feet is sometimes very convenient to avoid contentious meetings. So, but also, it has to be reasonable distance, I think.
It's 500 to 1,000 is a very common number.
Okay.
I think the county does, if it's a rural area, they extend theirs at past 1,000, but most of your urban areas.
Yes.
I think we need to increase the size of the signs.
Oh.
Signs, you can't even see them. I did a project in Inglewood one time and it was on a single family home lot that I had to subdivide. And the sign that the town required me to do, I think was like 6 foot by 6 foot with 2-inch letters and it was a giant sign.
I know you're gonna say 8.5 by 11.
But, so that, that there's no reason to not see it when you're driving past.
Yeah.
You can't see these signs. They mean nothing. They look like a little for sale sign.
A lot of them now are incorporating QR codes, so that you can have the minimum information that you can pull into that, and it will take you to a website. So, and we have, you guys have the documents on demand that you could pull into that they could get the full information to.
I'll also interject that staff has been so the question of, is it a requirement? Yes, it is a requirement to do a neighborhood meeting before you do an application. It hasn't been enforced by staff in the past. Of the last few months and the last applications that I've done, I've made that a point of that as something that we are reinstating.
With, real quickly on that, Jeff, that
Yeah.
question, whether or not it was implemented.
Neighborhood mailings.
When we give that data into the planning commission, is there something like you have the little icons that talk about, the bus, the water and everything else? Can you put something in there that states we have recommended a town meeting and this is when those meetings went? Because that way the general public that they're almost absent in relation to understanding the process. But I think within those individual tables of the slides that you produced, which are phenomenal, I would put something in there that talks about the interconnectivity between the public and those meetings.
Sure.
These were the dates they happened. These were the amount of people that were in attendance. Because when we come into these meetings, we may or may not be at those meetings, but I think it's going to give somewhat of a look. Somebody was there to understand what was going on.
Yeah, we probably would have to set who can go to, because.
Sure.
Yes, there's probably cases where we shouldn't go.
Completely agree, but yes, sir.
Right?
Correct.
Bob? Yeah. Right, and so staff goes for us and they should be reporting.
Yes, sir.
It does say in your code that at least one person from the planning department must attend those neighborhood meetings.
That'd be Chester.
Yes.
The one person.
And I think what we're talking about here is very important. And, you know, I spoke to you when you first came on board about 18.03, where it says that the planning director, and I don't like to take things away from people, but it says the planning director can combine a preliminary and final PUD if he or she believes it's not going to be controversial. And I don't know that people and staff always know whether something's going to be controversial. Certainly, this eliminates that decision or makes that decision more firm that you know it. There's nobody complaining at the meeting or they're complaining, because when we get a final and a preliminary together, it takes everything out of our hands. It took it out of our hands on a big apartment complex that got built. Because once they come in with a final, preliminary and final, and they talk about the millions of dollars that they spent to prepare the final, council usually has very little choice but to go down the wrong road sometimes. And so I think
That does happen. And we're gonna talk about the preliminary final combo later, but you're right. If there's a neighborhood meeting, no one shows up, it gives staff some more direction. If there's 500 people there, you know.
it's going to be controversial. So let's go with it.
Okay, let's jump. Okay, so we're gonna jump into, administrative versus hearing. So I'm gonna let Bob do this real quick.
So the good news is we're having a lot of discussion. We're halfway done in terms of time and we're on slide. Pretty far out of a lot, so. And the worst news is I don't talk as fast.
That's because you charge by the hour.
No, it's because I grew up in Oklahoma. Administrative versus hearing. There are several different distinctions represented on this slide. And one of the distinctions are the types of actions that government takes when you make decisions. And under the Constitution, government acts in one of three ways: administrative, legislative, or judicial. Okay, so think of that as we talk through these things, and those concepts flow through our discussions on due process also. And then the process that attaches to these different actions and the like. So administrative, that's that function. If you think about the federal government, that's the president and the agencies under the president, and the department of the all those departments and agencies. That's administrative function. Of course, judicial are the judges, we know what that's about. And Congress is the legislative group, and agencies also legislate at times. So when we're doing administrative things, we don't have to worry about so much due process and the like. We have to attach due process to try to ensure fairness in decisions when we're making decisions that start coming over to quasi judicial matters. So on the administrative side, less process, more discretion in some ways, but it's guided by guidance documents and the like. Public hearings on the other end usually represent judicial or quasi judicial type actions where the decision maker is acting like a judge. And the Constitution says you have to attach due process so we have really fair decisions being made. And so what you see here is kind of some of that continuum and the types of decisions under your code that fall within each of those categories. So let's go to the next slide. Some of the key differences between public meetings and public hearings. Anytime the planning commission where the town council gets together to talk about public business, it's gotta be a public meeting. You don't get to do that in private. Except in a very few exceptions where you can do an executive session. So that's the starting point for public meetings. All of your meetings are public meetings. Okay? Don't talk about public business unless you're in a public meeting. You're supposed to hold your business in public in these meetings. Under the Open Meetings Act, you have to have all discussions of public business of a quorum or two or more members, whichever is less, in a public meeting. I cited Corey here, but that's actually the Open Meetings Law. And same with the second point, basic notice requirements for public meetings. You have to have at least 24 hours notice through an agenda posted, in your case, on your website. You can attach greater notice requirements, and your code does that in some cases, 2 meetings, but that's the minimum. Typical process for a meeting is at the very beginning of the meeting, you call it to order, and at the end, you either continue the meeting or you adjourn the meeting. In between, you can have a lot of business. In between, you can even have public hearings. But the whole gathering, talking about public business, is a meeting. And some of your decisions under your plan development code are allowed to be made just in the public meeting. The last bullet on both these two columns is stated a little wrong. On the public meeting side, citizen input may be allowed, but is not required. So for instance, the town council meetings, you have a public comment section. You don't have to do that unless you adopt the requirement in your charter. There's no law that says you have to do that. If you're making a land development code decision that says public meeting and it doesn't specifically say you take public comment, you don't have to allow public comment. Contrast that with the public hearing though. Public hearings are special types of public meetings where the law attaches greater requirements to ensure public or due process. So you have to have usually greater notice to all the interested parties. And your code land development code specifically has notice requirements that are intended to give notice to the interested parties, the applicant, area of the neighborhood, landowners in the neighborhood, like. Typically, you open the public hearing, so you're already in a public meeting, and you open the public hearing. You have a process. Your code, we'll talk about this if we have time later, sets a very specific order of business for your public hearings. You're supposed to go through that. When you include the information reception part of the meeting, whether it's planning commission or town council, when you've heard from the applicant, when you've heard from staff, when you've heard from the interested parties that get to speak, when you're done hearing, then you close the public hearing. Okay, you're not done with the matter. Then you discuss among yourselves and you deliberate and you make a decision. But the hearing portion of that meeting, of that agenda item, has been closed, and then you deliberate, discuss, make your decision.
Can I ask you one question about that part of it?
Yes.
Okay, so the public hearing portion where the public gets to comment, technically it's a testimony. In our code, it states that they can even cross-examine.
Yes.
Okay, but we don't seem to ever follow that procedure in our public hearings. It gives a lot of leeway to the public to present evidence, which is what we're supposed to be gathering as evidence, yet we limit that. So
I have a slide somewhere
okay.
on that process.
We don't swear them in either. We don't swear anybody in.
That's right. Your code says you have to do that.
Right.
Something you'll hear from me is follow your code.
Okay.
One of my mantras with young attorneys is, I don't really care what you think until you tell me what the law says and you tell me what the facts are. And then we can talk about what you think and whether it's reasonable. But the starting point is, what does the law say? Follow the law. If your code says you need to do something, do it or change your code.
Right.
And so your point is one of the revelations I had as I was preparing this, and I'm sure Sheila and Jeff have lived with it for a while. That's in the code. You either need to follow it or get it out of the code.
That's right.
I got a question on the previous slide. Can you put that back up? I wanted to ask a question. You looped into this.
Okay.
But down there where it says preliminary PUD and then after final PUD, it says PC only. What does that mean that preliminary? What does that mean?
So that means that at planning commission, it's a public hearing. At town council, it's just a meeting. It's not a public hearing. And that's where the table says one thing, but maybe somewhere else in the code it says something different. But I haven't found that. I found that, Jeff found that for the final plat, but I didn't find that anywhere for those. So we have been overdoing it, but I think it's the right thing to do. It's just not required. So council doesn't have to hold a public hearing for the final PUD, but we've been doing it. You've been doing it.
Well, and you're saying we don't have to. You have a public hearing for a preliminary PUD?
For a preliminary PUD, it's at both planning commission and town council. So in parentheses is
Oh, so.
if it's
so
just that. plat.
so you left that parentheses out. Okay,
Right.
that's what we clarified on that. Thank you.
And when I was saying follow your code, you could do more. It's more onerous on the town. It grants greater public participation, all those things. But if your code says swear in your witnesses, you need to swear in your witnesses or
Right.
change your code.
Right.
I just didn't understand that.
Yeah,
And you can provide, would you be doing the swearing in as count or who would be
yeah.
answering?
So typically it's whoever's chairing the decision-making board. So the planning commission chair or the mayor. I've seen it done a couple of different ways. Sometimes it's like court. Every time somebody gets up, you make them swear in. What I like better, especially if you have a big case with a lot of people who are going to testify. Okay, everybody that's going to testify, stand up right now. We're going to swear you all in. And you swear them in, and then you just got to remember every time the person comes to the podium, did you swear in? Yes. Okay. Give your testimony.
All right, perfect. But I was hoping to do more.
Okay. But again, if we don't like that process, it's not necessary that we have to allow cross-examination in all cases. But we can talk about that. Any of those that you think are things you want to consider changing, we should talk about.
And wants to change the bond.
Yes.
On this side, what does it say?
Yeah, so in terms of participation, citizen input under a public hearing, you have to allow interested parties to participate. Okay. That's just written wrong. I did it like the other night, so. And I obviously didn't prove it. So on the left-hand side, citizen input may be allowed. On the right-hand side, interested party must be allowed. And the reason I say interested party, in some hearings is defined as all the public. Some public hearings, it's limited to certain interested parties, and that's more defined. And think of it again, like, if you're in court, just because you're interested, you don't get to go up and tell the judge what you think. And the same thing can be true with the matters before the town. But a lot of the business they do is impactful, at least to the neighborhood, and so they will be interested parties. Sometimes it's anybody. And then don't get tripped up, especially council, because there's certain things that the law says you have to have a public hearing on, and they're not quasi judicial. An annexation decision is not quasi judicial, it's legislative. Adopting your budget is not a quasi judicial matter. It's either administrative or legislative, but it's definitely not quasi judicial. The law says that's important enough that we're going to require you to allow the public to attend and give comments. So we're going to allow the public there. So just don't get tripped up on that little nuance. Let's talk about vested property rights. With the slide, let's go ahead and go to the next one to pick up some time here. So get questions a lot of times about vested property rights. That's one of those buzz phrases that a lot of people use, and they use it without knowing what they're talking about, frankly. So vested property rights is a legal concept that is grounded in common law and the Constitution. And the idea behind vested property rights are, if you have done certain things, you should get to use your property in ways that you expected when you were doing those certain things. And so it's defined by statute, consistent with a lot of case law, as the right to complete in the development context. The right to complete development or use of property based on the approval and the rules that were in place at the time of the approval. Okay. Now, what that means is I go in and I get my zoning. And at that time, I get residential, multifamily, let's just use that. And it allows me X density per acre. Well, I have the right, if I get a vested property right, I have the right for that period that's vested to go ahead and develop it. It's 20 units per acre. I get to develop my property for 20 units per acre, even if the town code gets changed and drops it to 18 units per acre. Okay, if I have a vested property right, I get to use my property for the period that's been determined to be vested under the rules that I got my rights. Okay. Now that recognizes though that, things change and the town can change its code requirements and maybe 18 is correct. A lot of your applicants, when they come through, they don't get vested property rights. They get an approval. Okay.
It's sketch plan, it's not a vested right, correct?
You have to go through, in your code, you have to go through a very specific process to get a vested property right. And under your code, it's only available for a final PUD, a conditional use site plan, or a final subdivision plat. Those three smallest bullets there. That's what your code says are the only things that you can get a statutory vested property right in.
And that means that we can change those densities at any one of those.
So for someone that gets a final PUD but didn't go through the process to get it vested, you could change the rules on it and they have to conform with the new rules unless, and this is where we go back to the common law and it gets pretty mushy. There's a bunch of ways under the common law that if the property owner reasonably acted in reliance and expends money and does a bunch of stuff, they've got a strong argument that common law says you should allow me to, it's fair for you to allow me to continue under the original rules. So we have to look under both, but it's not an absolute statutory vested right unless they follow that process. But if they're out there and they've done enough work, you may have to honor it as a vested right, even though it hadn't gone through your formal process. And that's the common law vested rights that's noted here. And that's a constitutional principle that really has its base, the takings clause. Can't take property away without due process. The due process includes the substantive requirement of payment for lost value. And so the courts have said, if you go so far acting upon in reasonable reliance on the actions of the government, you should be able to acknowledge it. But you have to show that you really went somewhere and did something. And it usually requires out-of-pocket expenditures or a very definite change of financial position or some other significant change of position.
Well,
I'm seeing concern back here.
well, yeah, the vested thing has given me difficulty. Where does it, I'm a property owner.
Mhm.
So what's the first thing I do to get a vested property right? What's the first thing I do to get that?
Yeah, so the clearest way to get that in the town monument is to file an application for a final PUD, conditional use site plan, or final subdivision plat, and a vested right, file an application for a vested right, and go through the additional steps under the code required to get them.
So when they come to us for a final PUD, they do or do not have a vested property right
Not,
before the PUD is approved.
well, they certainly don't have it before the PUD is approved.
Okay, in all cases.
So does that mean that while the planning commission is sitting there, if they want to make a recommendation that is a deviation from our standard for density, for example, they can do that. And they can approve less dense development as part of that final PUD. And that becomes then the vested right that gets put before the council?
You're misusing vested again.
No.
Yeah.
So I think the question he has is if you have a preliminary PUD that said 20 units per acre. And they come in with a final PUD and the town wants to drop it from 20 to 18. The disconnect between the preliminary and final, can they still do that? And yes. If they come in with a final PUD and want it to be vested, then that's a separate, that's the vested part. The other is just, they have, no word for vested, it's not vested.
I just want to say, I think a lot of us think vested as being possibly the rights that are in perpetuity with by entitlements.
Yeah.
And that is not the correct definition of the term. It's actually a very specific type of right.
Yeah.
And I'll let you expand that.
Yeah. And so with each of your approvals, and this is kind of last bullet point, you have a duration for that approval. So you get a preliminary plan approval, that gives you the right to go apply for a final plan that's consistent with the preliminary plan. And if you meet the code criteria, you have the right to be approved. The right to be approved. Okay,
Not an obligation.
that's right. Now, during that period though, because it's not a vested right, the council could come in and change the rules. And say between preliminary and final, you gotta make these extra steps. Or now a final plat has to have something more, something less. It has that ability. And the only way the property owner could defeat that is if they were able to then prove up a common law vested right based on their preliminary plan and the actions they took in reliance. Generally, that's not going to be able to be done because your preliminary plan doesn't give you the right to develop your property.
So in the simplest terms, so at every public hearing, the developers or whoever, landowners come to ask for something they don't yet have. So every public hearing isn't, so the whole term of property rights, which a lot of people throw around all the time.
That's right.
You're coming to a public hearing to ask for a right you don't yet have.
At the preliminary.
At any stage.
At any stage.
At any
At any stage,
public
okay.
hearing is to ask for a right you don't yet have.
That's right. You're asking based on where I've been, can I make the next step?
And we'll talk about that more in a bit, because there are certain actions at planning commission and council, like between final plat, preliminary PUD, and other things that we'll get into.
It's inside that. I mean, same thing as we're talking about the little icons. Put a little blurb in there when the presentation's going, staff recommends approval, got it. There are no conveyed property rights or anything associated before it comes to the planning commission. So that way we know what you're talking about and we have a clear understanding of what was in agreement before it even went forward. Because I think there's somewhat of a disconnect between the planning staff, planning commission, and what's agreed to or not agreed to. So again, I hear what we're saying. Nothing's agreed to, but I think by putting it on paper and as it comes forth to the planning commission, we understand that there is no agreements. There's nothing on the table. There's no people are, well, we have the right to. No, you don't. It says right there that you have no rights.
Yeah, well, I think we're gonna talk about that more in depth later, like what are the entitlements and what are. You.
And I understand. I'm just getting at the point that the conveyance from what the staff is seeing to what we're seeing, I think is different. So I think what you tell us you're saying in relation to when it comes to us, it has to be very clear. Because we, I think, are getting cross lines on what we perceive that you're saying. It's not clear from what we understand. And then it makes a lot of time, or we consume a lot of time that now gets filtered up to the staff or the town council where they're, well, what do they mean here? Well, this is what we thought staff meant.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
In a final PUD ordinance, is there language in there that gives the applicant vested property rights, or is that assumed?
No, it's not assumed. Can you back up one second? So Article 3 of your land development code sets out the vested rights requirements, including the process and what you get out of it. You have to ask, you have to go, an applicant has to ask for vested rights, has to apply for vested rights, has to, provide this information. And then what they get, is an approval that has an effective date, that has a specific duration of the vesting. Usually, we're gonna have a vesting agreement that goes with that, so everybody's really clear on what is it.
And that's what we never saw. We never understood whether or not that had been an agreement going in when the actual format was going forward.
Have there been submissions or has the town?
I don't know of any.
There's been discussions of the term vested.
Yes, sir.
In various ways and forms. To Bob's point that there's an actual vested agreement. Correlated with that is also a vested note. There's a note that actually lands on the final plat and it states this is vested.
Is
For a
it
certain
voted on?
period of time. Only if they ask for that application and that process.
And I
So
don't recall seeing it.
so
in the
we would have,
ordinance.
we all would have seen this,
Yes,
and I don't ever recall hearing in 3 years the term vested used.
correct.
It's never been asked for.
I haven't seen any since I've been working for you since January.
Okay,
No.
so this is.
About in these hearings,
Sure.
and I'm like.
But they.
Get vested.
It's invested that they're.
Yes.
We're taking it one step further to have.
I didn't know.
One other question. So in all of these different processes that they go and they apply on, and we have a duration of applicability or approval. And that's one thing, that's tied to the approval piece. And I think, not to put words in Bob's mouth, but to try to bring it into a different set of words. You can go through that approval process and take the risk as an applicant over that time frame of approval to assume that you have all of what's said in your plat, but town council or planning commission could change the rules in that process of time. Say a sketch, such a site plan is approved and recorded. It has a 3-year duration of time that it's valid before it is expired. If they went the extra step of having it vested, and having that vesting note and that vesting agreement put in place with that site plan, there couldn't be anything that town council could say to them about a change in density or a setback or some other site development component tied to that site plan that makes them have to course correct when they're ready to actually build in that 3-year period when they've been approved.
But it is capped at 3 by statute.
By our code and in duration of approval, we have stated in each one of these applications how long we feel that application is approved and valid.
Can you go beyond state statute?
So
Can you
so
go
for
beyond
vested
3 years?
rights, I think it's
It's
5
3.
years.
I thought it was 3.
Yeah, but you are allowed to extend that.
It's 3 years for this.
Three.
That's what I read.
Yeah.
But you can extend it, yeah, absolutely.
When they come in with the sketch plan, if they ask for it to be vested at that point,
Your code doesn't allow it.
That's right.
code doesn't allow.
It doesn't allow.
It only-
Doesn't allow until we get to what you show us up here.
Only those.
Even though these people stand in front of us and tell us once we've gone through a site plan, but you can't take that away from us.
They're talking about their entitlements,
Yeah.
going through the entitlement process, not the vested process.
So. The difference between entitlement and
Well-
vested.
Vested is very specific to this. Entitlements are the process you go through to get entitlements on your property, the zoning, the plating, all of those things.
This essentially is an agreement that states that we've gone one step further and everyone involved says we can't change our mind over the next 3 years or that duration of time is, and we give you the full value of that right for that time period. That's that vested piece it is. that is separate from the entitlements tied to each one of these other applications, which have an approval period, but are exposed to you making potential changes in the time frame that they've been approved for. That you could turn back and say, you need to
So
change
when
this.
it comes up to the final PUD, even though they have an entitlement, it can be changed? Is that what we're
The
saying?
code could be changed
The
to
code.
apply different standards, yes.
To that final PUD if they didn't have it vested.
And you can make changes between the preliminary PUD and the final. What your staff will look at is, is the final in conformance with the preliminary? And then they bring it to you and you say, well, we actually want to ask for one more thing, you can still do that. So the preliminary is you looking at it from a holistic point, the final is when you get down to the detail and you can ask for more. Okay. I think there needs to be more discussion on this. Yeah, definitely, yeah. So I would say, when you hear vested, throw it out, unless you have your staff saying, pay attention, they're asking for vested agreement or a vesting agreement.
Blue light is circling.
The blue
I think by having that blue light is gonna help us because it's gonna keep some indicators associated what is, just like Danny was saying, it's gonna vest in on what their attachments are or their agreements long-term. And then what are they vested in as far as code here? That's why, again, that's one thing that now I think if we can see it, what was agreed upon, there's nothing hidden that may come forth and say, yeah, no, if it's a final, now we're in the details. Now we can start asking for more.
I'll take one step further with this, just take that and explain that a little further for you, Chair. If we had a vested application coming in, we would go and we would look at what point they were vested. We would then need to look at code as it is written at that moment when it was vested.
Yes, sir.
And then we would have to say to you, this is what code says today that is different and is not valid because we are vested to the code that was in place the moment that this was approved.
I think
With the vested.
Mike,
But I don't think there are any.
can you make a note when we redo the technology in the council chambers to add a blue light?
Kmart, come on.
All right,
Moving forward.
moving forward. So I'm gonna go through some of these quickly now. So fees, these are the fees that you pay when you apply for an application. There are pass-through costs for consultant fees, attorney's fees, advertising and posting. The code requires a retainer. At some point, the town went back to just having them be billed, but I believe they're going back to the retainer, but
We are.
it's good. Okay.
We are on a retainer system now.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because we've had accounts receivable that have piled up that we are fixing. And we're
Yes.
going back to a more assuring point where we are able to make sure that.
You don't have to approve or permit anything if they haven't paid their bills.
Correct.
Unfortunately, some of them aren't in the town, so it's kind of hard for you to enforce that because they're never gonna come to you for
And
something.
some of the things we haven't charged the retainer for before are attorney's fees.
Yes,
And so we're adding that into our retainer requirements that they
Yeah,
pay
but
our attorney.
you're allowed to, already.
Yeah, Bob likes it.
So permitting before permits, you can be charged a fee, and then there are all sorts of fees. So you adopt a fee schedule, you get to see all the fees. So if you ever have questions about some of the fees associated with development, ask your staff. Board of Adjustment, I'm not gonna go into this too much. It's now the Planning Commission. It was changed with the charter, so that section of your code is kind of outdated, will need to be updated eventually. Basically, they hear appeals to decisions and they hear requests for modifications to your development standards. So they can look at minimum area or lot width, maximum building of heights, maximum height of buildings, minimum front, side, or rear yards, off-street parking requirements, landscaping, fencing, or sign requirements. The one thing that your code does not allow is a use variance. Some think use variances are spot zoning and illegal, others think it's not. So, City of Colorado Springs does a variance of use. So if you have a zone district that says single-family residential isn't allowed, you could go to Colorado Springs and do a use variance to see if you could have it allowed even on just one lot. So, but that's not allowed here. So you don't do that.
Spot zoning is also kind of a big thing from an AICP thing, so it'll probably be a hard thing to it's a hard thing to
Swallow.
swallow. defend what happened.
It's wrong.
So,
It's wrong.
but just know that your code does not allow a variance of use. You'll hear that from other communities, but it's not allowed here. All right, so I'm gonna kind of skip through to the next one, which we're gonna go on to subdivision. So that was all just your administrative procedures, how you do things. Now we're gonna get into some of the more beefy things that a lot of you already know because you've been looking at them for a while. So subdivision, we have administration and procedures. The general procedure, you go to planning commission and then you go to council. You have major subdivisions versus minor subdivisions. And the thing I would say, go to the next one. There you go. So major and minor, not a big deal. Major or minor subdivisions, you can't have more than 4 lots. There's no public improvements. There's a whole list of things. And then a major subdivision is everything else. From a council standpoint, the reason the definition of major subdivision is important is because the code says that you can limit the number of major subdivisions that are on your agenda. So as staff, they look at how many major subdivisions. It's not applications, it's major subdivisions. So you might have a PUD and a conditional use and a rezoning, and you may have 5 or 10 of those, but it's really major subdivisions that it's referring to. But I still think staff does a pretty good job of looking at how much is on this agenda, how long it's gonna be. But if you ever wonder when it says you can only have 2 major subdivisions, based on that. All right, next, types of subdivisions. So we have the sketch plan. The purpose, evaluate whether a subdivision conforms to the comprehensive plan, whether or not the subdivision will comply with the review and approval criteria, and address issues early on in the review process. So you bring the sketch plan. It's typically a little bubble diagram showing where the uses will be. Maybe, depending on the size of it, they might throw in some lotting patterns, but it is nothing that is held in stone. It's a, here's what we think we're gonna do. Here's where we think everything's gonna be.
It's a vision.
What?
It's a vision.
It's a vision, yes.
Concept.
Thank you.
Typically, if you're going to approve them, they're gonna be done by resolution and not ordinance. So it's along those lines, but you don't even really have to adopt them by resolution. Process, planning commission and public hearing, there is no requirement for town council. So they don't even have to go to council. And then compliance, they have 5 review criteria and they're valid for 2 years. They are not recorded. So again, this is duration of approval, not vesting. Next, we have the preliminary plat. It's more detailed than the sketch plan. It should incorporate comments and guidance from the sketch plan. It includes the layout of the subdivision with lots, streets, and tracks. Final engineering design with all bearings and distances don't occur until the final plat. So it's more, again, it's that next step. So we've gone from a bubble concept to a tentative layout where we're working out the kinks. We're talking about where we want access, where we need public infrastructure, where we need open space. The purpose, the director may waive if the proposed subdivision is not part of an overall master plan. So if it's a small little subdivision, you can go ahead and skip from preliminary to final. Again, it's up to the director, the neighborhood meeting, you'll be able to determine if it's controversial. And then the director may approve a combination of a preliminary and final. Again, if it's determined that there are no significant issues that need to be evaluated with the preliminary plat before a final plat is submitted. Now, why would a director do that? Let's take a 1-lot resident or a commercial development for a KFC. What would a preliminary plat tell us that a final plat's not? It's 1 lot. So that is a lot of times why you'll see a preliminary combo on small 1-lot commercial. On a multi-lot subdivision residential with a lot of access points, you should not be seeing a combo preliminary final plat. Okay. Process, planning commission and town council has to have complied to 9 review criteria. And again, this one is valid for 2 years. And by valid for 2 years, what I mean is after 2 years, if the preliminary plat hasn't been implemented, and implemented, that means submittal of a final plat, they would have to come back and start it. Okay. Final plat. Final plat shall correspond to every significant respect of the preliminary plat. A complete review is conducted at the final plat subdivision, and we have all bearings and distances, survey monumentation, certificates for approval, and we put all of those on the plat, and then everybody signs it and it gets recorded. The purpose is to complete the subdivision of land so that when you go and record it, you can then legally sell off those individual lots. This also goes to planning commission and town council, has 10 review criteria. There's no expiration provided that the plat is recorded within 3 months of approval, and they can get 1 3-month extension, and signatures are required.
Yeah, third, fourth bullet is something that we're looking at changing.
It is a pretty short time, because a lot of times people don't report them within the first 3 months if they.
Wait, it's 3 years.
Or could be that too. Yeah. So then we have, after final plats, we have plat amendments. So plat amendments are administrative. These are things where somebody comes in and they need to adjust a lot line over, or there's an easement that needs to be moved. So they can do a plat amendment. So it's not creating new lots, it's just adjusting lines on a plat, maybe correcting the language on the plat. So that is why you don't see them, because it's minor amendments to a recorded document.
License director.
Oh, yeah, director reviews and approves. They may forward to planning commission or council if they feel like it's gonna be controversial. If there's a lot of hoopla around it, it can be forwarded. Most of the time they're not. Private review criteria, there's no expiration considering if it's gonna be recorded, and then you do have to sign it and record it. Then lastly, we have plat and right-of-way vacation. These can happen at any time. Public right-of-way vacation is in accordance with 43.2, 302, and 303 of the Colorado statutes. You can have vacation by plat, and you can have vacation by ordinance. So what you'll typically hear is if you have something that was created by plat, it should be vacated by plat. If you had something that was created by separate instrument, it should be vacated by separate instrument. So if you had an easement that was created by a separate instrument, somebody wants to vacate it, they will bring it to you by that. So you can vacate public easements, you can vacate private easements if they're the party to that easement comes along with it, but you cannot vacate private easements that aren't yours. Unless they're on a plat and we're vacating the whole plat, but then you still have. There are all these unlesses. So right of way, the fun thing about right of way is if you vacate right of way, the property splits down the middle. Now, there is some interpretation that if it's part of the original subdivision, it all goes within that subdivision. So if you have a road that was on the perimeter of a subdivision and that road is vacated, there's kind of a question whether or not that half goes to that neighbor because they weren't in the regular subdivision or the initial subdivision, or if it all goes to the other one on the right because they were in the initial subdivision. But until that comes up and you're asked questions, just know that it splits down the middle. Subdivision dedications. So what is the dedication procedure? Established prior to subdivision plat approval. It's fee simple dedications. We're looking at parkland, school land. So let's start with school because it's easy. We send it out to the school. We send them a referral. They can either ask for land or they can ask for fees in lieu of land. I know we get a lot of people coming in wondering, why did we just take money? It's not we, it's not the town. The school makes that decision. It's theirs. The town is simply the pass-through. Yeah. So if they want land, we will help facilitate that. If they want fees, fees are collected at the time of building permit. The school district sets those fees. They do a study of the value of the land. They determine what that fee is. They bring it before the council, and then the council can adopt if they agree with that fee, and it becomes part of your fee schedule.
Does that change if we annex the school districts or no?
Does not.
Okay.
So, well, it does for that property owner. So if the property is in the county, the school fees are less there because the county has not adopted the new school fee that the district set. If it comes into the town, then the new school fee is implied because you've already adopted it or applied.
Ask Holly.
Just considerably more.
So I'm gonna jump to parks now because that was one where it comes in, we have park dedications. Their commercial is 0.05 acres per gross acre. Residential is 5 acres per 1,000 population. So as a town, you could say we want the land or we want fees in lieu. The difference here is the Triview Metropolitan District. So if it's in Triview, the town does not collect park fees. The town could still implement the comprehensive plan and the open space and parks that are shown there. The town can say, we would like to have this area. It's in our comp plan. We want this to be a public park, and then work with Triview to figure out the ownership and maintenance of that. But if a development happens in the Triview area, the town does not collect park fees. That's kind of the difference here. Any questions on park land dedication or fees in lieu?
If the town wanted to have that park, let's say the one in Sanctuary Point or Home Place Ranch, then we would be on the hook to maintain that. If we said, hey, Triview, that's not gonna be your park. It's not gonna be a Triview owned and maintained park. It's gonna be a monument owned and maintained park.
I think it would have to be some kind of amendment to the agreement between the towns. Because the agreement says Triview will own and maintain. So I think there would have to be some kind of agreement that amends that to allow it.
But you're saying we could require a land dedication.
According to your code, you can require land dedication. It's the agreement with Triview that says that they will own and maintain land.
Right, but we could require land in Triview's district to be a park. And then Triview would assumably take over ownership of that.
Well, we do that now.
I think that is the discussion you'd have to have with Triview. Your code says you can, but the agreement with Triview has different language as far as the ownership and maintenance. So how does that work when the town says, we want a 5-acre park over here, and Triview says, we don't have the money to own and maintain it? That's where the rub has to be, and we have to figure that out.
Gotcha. Thanks.
At what point does that take place? At what point in the process does that take place?
As far as the dedication of land, so the actual, you ask for it during the final plat and the zoning. So you can ask for it throughout the process, but the actual transfer happens when the plat's recorded.
But if it belonged to Tribeview and we wanted it as a park, at what point in this process will we say, whoa, we want to work this out before we go any further?
I think you would want to do that before it gets to the planning commission or the council, but that would be a discussion that the town would have to have. Do we have the funds to own and maintain this park when Triview is collecting?
So who initiates that conversation and who works it? That's all I'm saying.
Oh, so if they come in for a pre-application and we see on the future land use plan that there's a park there, we're gonna mention, hey, there's a park there. It's in Triview, but we still might want that park. Then we're gonna have the discussion with the Parks Department, and the Parks Department will say, oh, yes, we still want that, or no, we really don't want that. That's where those conversations happen.
That's where you start working. Okay,
That's
that's
where
all.
it starts.
No,
Yeah.
very good.
Okay, trying to go quickly through some of these. What's next? Public improvements and security. So after you get a plat approved and recorded and they're ready to start building, the code requires a public improvements agreement, not only for plats, but for site plans. So what that is an agreement between the town and the developer that they agree that they will put all of those improvements in. They also has to post collateral. So they post collateral in either the form of a subdivision bond or a letter of credit. Those are held here in town. We hold on to them until everything's done, because if they decide to run, we can call on those. The bad thing about bonds is you have to go to court typically. You have to pay full your fees to get the funds. Letters of credit, it's a direct draw. So you should try to get letters of credit whenever you can, but mostly you get subdivision bonds.
Collateral is synonymous with sure.
Yes. So that is your way of assuring that everything will be done. We collect 125%. Okay, sorry. 25%, which in some believe is too high. So there have been discussions that, not us, like on the development side, that might be too high, but.
That is that first.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay. So
Yeah. I'm good. So you collect, and they put together a cost estimate, the engineer reviews it. Yeah, that's right. So they put together a cost estimate, the engineer reviews it to ensure that it's actual, that it's feasible, that this is the right amount, that they're not just throwing numbers out there. And then they have to go get the collateral, they bring it in. Once they bring it in, then they can be released to start construction. After construction is done, you go through the acceptance process where an inspector goes out, looks at the property, sees that it's done correctly. So did they put in the curb, gutter, and sidewalk to standard? Does the concrete pass the inspection points, storm drainage, all of that? If they accept it, then we can release the bonds and the collateral, and then we go into the warranty period, which is 2 years. So they usually will to switch out the bond with a warranty, and that's what we hold on for 2 years. That way, if something goes wrong, we have funds to go out and fix it if they don't come back and do it themselves. Okay,
So if you want to bond around the lien with a mortgage lender, it's 150%. So, I mean, I don't think that's not too
well,
big.
they're just comparing it to other communities.
Gotcha.
So, I know that came up with the HBA a couple of times.
Of course it
So,
did.
I'm- The other thing out there is cost recovery improvements. So I think we've done one of those, but that's if you have a development come in and they have to build a road and the road actually benefits their neighbor and they take all of that cost up front, they can file cost recovery against that neighbor. So when that person comes in to develop, they have to pay that developer, the original developer back. So there are cost recovery in your code. Zoning regulations. So you have your zoning map, your zoning district boundaries, and zoning of annexed land, rezoning, site plan required. So in this case, I think we'll talk about the zoning map is your official map. So if anybody ever questions whether or not the zoning boundaries are correct, you go to the zoning map, that's official. It usually should lock into your lot lines, it should lock into your roadways, and if it's tied to a creek, if the creek boundary changes, you follow the creek boundary. All of your zonings should have a legal description tied to them so that if there's any question with that, you can go back as well. If it's split between, it usually goes to the middle of your right of way too. So if you have a commercial district on this side and residential on this side, it typically will go to the middle of the roadway and build it that way. Zoning of annexed land, you already know about that. Basically, you treat that like a rezoning, go through the whole public hearing process. And then a site plan is required for any commercial developments. Those are administrative if they're a straight zoning, but if they're a PUD, your final PUD is your site plan for that purpose. I'm trying to go through them because I'm reading what she's done. Zone districts, these are all the zone districts that you have. Within each zone district, you have permitted uses, you have dimensional standards. So if somebody comes in with a commercial center, you can read what that zone district allows, then you can go to the use table and see what uses are allowed. And then you can go to the dimensional standards to see what the setbacks might be, height, all of those.
Understanding about zone districts and why we have strict zones versus PUDs or is that a zone?
That's a set. We're gonna go down.
Right.
So this is your zoning map. We have district uses, planned unit development. So planned unit development is, there are, how many criteria in here? There are some things that you should look at whenever you're thinking about doing a planned unit development. There are 13 purposes to do it. If something is silent in a PUD, it falls back to the code. So let's say they did it single family residential and they did a commercial and then they didn't identify parking. Then you follow the parking codes within your zoning regulations. It's follow the PUD unless it's silent, and if the PUD is silent, jump back to your code. Something you should consider with your code update is requiring a PUD-based zone district. So if it's SF1, everything in the SF1 applies except for those things identified in the PUD. That way there's never a question. So it's something you might want to consider in the future. It just kind of takes out that, well, I don't know, did they mean for it to be that way? But if it's not on the PUD, fall back on your code, okay? Types of PUD applications, you have your preliminary and you have your final. Your preliminary has a long list of things that it has to be done. Your final has the exact same list plus a few more. So when you're looking at a preliminary PUD and a final PUD, there's really a difference of like 3 or 4 things between the two. It's just when they bring in the preliminary PUD, it should be more of a conceptual, but by the time they get to that final, that is what is going to be built. That is what gets recorded.
It's also possible that it's broader and bigger in terms of land area.
Mhm.
And so you'll set the baseline of what your PUD zoning is for that broad piece of land. And then they might need to phase over time some chunks of it. And so then you do the final PUD piece. And at that point, they may make tweaks that are based off that preliminary PUD.
So on the, go ahead, Kathy.
So something that's being done differently today than I remember in my past is a PUD and a preliminary or a sketch plan. If you have a range of densities, you know, this part can be 8 to 12 density, this part can be 6 to whatever. That was your negotiating range. that was what you could negotiate. What I have found here is if your range is 8 to 12, they're entitled to 12. And I don't think that's right.
If they're within the range and the PUD says 8 to 12.
They're
and they come
entitled to 12, so we should not do ranges anymore.
That's right.
Okay,
I agree with that.
all right.
And also the PUD in the code says something to the effect of it allows flexibility in exchange for amenities or something to that effect. Yet we don't seem to really get amenities out of this.
That's right.
So, it's too subjective and somehow we need to nail that down as well.
Yeah. Okay. Supplementary uses. So these are general performance standards, no heat, no glare, no radiation. So if you have uses like bed and breakfast, group homes, home occupations, industrial or mobile homes, this is your section that has, not only do they have to meet all the original standards, they have additional standards that they have to meet. So these are your supplemental uses. Marijuana, not allowed, basically is what it says, but you have that section. Wireless telecommunications, most of these are administrative unless it's a new freestanding tower and then it will come to you. These are highly regulated by, we're limited a lot by what we can and can't do, but we can still have them apply and look at them. So you'll see, well, you won't see them, but there are administrative applications for switching out of equipment. As long as they don't change the tower, change the height, build a new tower, most of it is happening internal with your administrative staff. Because there's not a lot that we could even let you do if you wanted to see them.
If you just had one for Dish for CMRS. They're a new provider. They just recently got bandwidth from the feds. And they're going on an existing tower, so we wouldn't see it. But if they were standing up on a new tower, then the council would see it.
Yes.
Planning commission would see it too.
Is this the one that's going at?
There are two that are happening up in Sanctuary Point.
Okay,
That's where I believe some of that is, yeah.
Those are existing.
Well, the services are already existing, but then they're adding new antennas. into
yeah.
that-
onto
Onto an existing
Yeah.
area.
So there are some things that you can ask them to do if it's new, but on existing stuff, it's a switch for switch, not bigger. There are certain criteria that have to be.
We have criteria that asks these wireless carriers to make the antennas look like the surrounding areas. Like if you go up 105 east, there is a tree that has.
We have architectural compatibility, landscaping, lighting, access. There are criteria in there they do have to meet.
Okay.
Yep. So you have freestanding, building mounted, roof mounted, and then there are standards for ground mounted. There's requirements for co-location, and then we have review procedures that are set by the code for administrative, or if they have to go to the area bodies.
Some of the most recent are like building mounted items.
Yeah.
So they're not freestanding posts that you would want to make a tree look like a tree. Okay, they're kind of been embedded architecturally into something like a water tower or something like that.
Sure.
So they're not being actually seen.
All right, site design standards. So you have lots. How do you measure lots? What's a front yard? What's a side yard? Where is the front yard if it's a corner lot? You have blocks. You have to set standard length, size, maximum length. Usually your maximum length is determined by your fire department. It's kind of the length of their hose, but sometimes it's longer. So there are block lengths. You have monuments and markers. What are the standards for the monuments and the monumentation that has to go on the ground? Easements. We have requirements for public utilities, cross access between commercial developments, shared driveways, streets and alleys, 2 points of access for a subdivision over 25 lots, sidewalks and trails. We require sidewalks on each. You require sidewalks on each side of the street 5 feet wide, and then trails have to be 8 feet wide. Natural features have to be built into design, retaining the trees. That's in there as well. Open space. What may include, how do you evaluate it, or if it's good open space? Storm drainage and erosion control. It makes reference to all the standards. Remember I talked about earlier, the design criteria, the springs and stuff, makes reference to those standards and how they have to meet that. Flood damage prevention, irrigation ditches, water, fire protection, sanitary sewer, all of that stuff is in there with some basic elements and basic criteria that have to be met. Buffers and screening, so there are standards for buffers and screening between uses. Fencing, what types of fencing, like no barbed wire, so types of fencing that are allowed, making sure you don't put a fence in the sight distance. And why do we have sight visibility triangles so people can back out of their driveways, go into an intersection without seeing, getting hit by other cars or hitting other humans. Parking standards. So we have general parking requirements, off-street parking. We have, the number of spaces per unit, and then, how wide the aisles have to be if it's at a 90-degree versus a 45-degree. What size of parallel parking space has to be, what size of standard space has to be. So you have off-street loading requirements. Those are if you have trucks delivering materials, where those have to be located. You have truck and recreational vehicle parking, where it's allowed, where it's prohibited. Shared parking facilities, we allow them within 300 feet. You can have 1,000 feet if it's for employees. Modifications or deferrals, so up to 50% of your parking can be deferred. But there are 3 criteria that have to be met. So let's say you're doing phasing development, you may not want to have all the parking up front. There can be a deferral on that. Staffing requirements for drive-throughs, those are in place. Design requirements for lots, access, wheel stops, lighting, anything you can think of that goes into a parking lot or a parking area. There are criteria for, and then there are also ADA requirements. Lighting standards.
Landscape standards. We're going to lighting
We're
standards.
jumping to lighting, I'll go back to landscaping. Lighting, there's a lot of talk about dark sky. Try to say it's dark sky, but there is nothing in the code that specifically says dark sky compliant. There are a lot of the criteria in the code that can help that. To minimize the effects on lighting on the night sky in order to prevent views of the night sky, to enhance safety, minimize glare, minimize negative impacts of lighting. So, you know, you have to prevent objectionable light crossing property lines. You have to have things downcast. There are samples of approved fixtures that meet the dark sky criteria. And so when staff does site plan review, they try to enforce it.
Yes.
There has to be the photometric plans, criteria, but as far as I know, that question has come up, are you a dark sky? Not specifically in your code at this point, but
It's more of a, the way the language reads, it's kind of like, it's not forced, it's encouraged. That's the language. We try to push it towards more of an enforced.
right. So your photometric plan they have to do a study that shows that the light does not go past the property line. So that is something that does get enforced, but the actual dark sky, equipment or the bugs or whatever they're called isn't in there.
There is some code that talks about specific levels of hook candles. And it is at a lower level that does kind of land itself to dark sky. We have an application right now that we are pushing them to go darker with their lights on a commercial site.
So landscape standards, these are your standards for parking lot, like 1 tree for every island. So much percentage of coverage of turf, so many shrubs per so much square feet. So that's what your landscape standards. And then they're broken up by, is it a single family development? Is it a commercial development? Is it industrial? Is it in a buffer yard? Is it all of those elements within landscape standards? So when those come in, staff looks at them to see if count trees. We count trees, we count shrubs to see if they meet that criteria. And if they do, then we can look at, are they in the site visibility triangles? Is there other places we could put them? Could we cluster them? Those things. Downtown design standards, there's really only 2nd Street and then streets that intersect with 2nd Street. And there are criteria for those within the code.
A little bit more special.
Yeah, because it's a little much.
Exactly.
Signs, oh, no, you go.
Landscaping part.
Okay.
Okay.
That's you.
So, real quick, the notion of lot coverage was a topic of a lot of discussion. We had an issue with the definition of lot coverage, how that impacts our PUDs and site development. I'm just going to walk you through very quickly, just as a prototypical scenario of how that kind of plays out and when we apply code to a development. So in this case, we're talking about a 1 acre, 43 by 60 square foot lot that is commercial. Okay. Lot coverage in a lot of cases, we're saying 40% max is the lot coverage that we've got in town. Based on our current definition now that we have in place, it's just about building footprint and like canopies. All right. So in this case, in an acre, we're talking about 17,420 square feet. the other end of that to this bookend, and this is important for future conversations that we want to have about imperviousness. Okay, we have on the other end, we have a landscaping requirement that's only 10% minimum, but that is there. So that's your one way of like, here's your building piece of land, here's the landscape piece. We only require them to be 10% of that be landscape. And then what does that leave you? Leaves you with 50% of what's there as being what you need for available parking square footage. Okay, but then how does that play out, Jack? Because that's a big building and whatnot. That parking spaces right there. Technically, a good rule of thumb, for every parking space, you need 300 square feet of asphalt, essentially. A parking stall is 18 by 9, that's less than 300 square feet. So that additional piece is taking into account that drive aisle component and all of the circulation ties in with that parking. So looking at 21,780, you need 72 parking spaces. Okay, well, there's parking requirements that play into that. You need 261 parking spaces to meet that 17,424 square building. So this, all of a sudden now we have site parameters that start to restrict what can happen from a development standard. So if we say, okay, we can only have 72 parking spaces, how much building footprint can we have? We only have 4,800 square feet. What do we do with that remaining 12,624? Since our parking standards are a minimum, what developers do then is they take that remaining amount and they shuffle it out to see how much bigger the building they can get. If that's what they need from an optimum standpoint, looking at an optimum, we can get to 7,066 square feet. And you need to add a little extra green. That green rectangle basically represents little islands in your parking that where your trees come up and whatnot. Think of it that way from a theoretical standpoint. So, that's kind of what you end up with. And so ultimately the imperviousness is still being occurred because they're using that time, that space to get whatever building they need and whatever parking. So we have parking minimums. A lot of times they may say, well, it's a commercial lot. I'm doing this KFC and I only need a 4,000 square foot building, but I have enough land here to do more parking than what the minimum is. So I'm going to ask for as much parking as I can possibly get on there. And our only code requirement is 10% for landscaping. Now, there could be a drainage component into that might play into that. And then we need to allocate land over for, that retention pond or that detention pond piece. A lot of cases when we talk about a one lot commercial, it's part of a larger development. And then there's a detention pond already designed in the broader master plan and everything. You follow me so far? Okay. So that's basically where we're at. And I just wanted to give you a sense of that because I think that'll help us have better conversations later when we revisit imperviousness.
And this is the footprint of the building, so it could go up.
That's what I was just gonna ask, does a square foot include vertical?
Yes, absolutely. No, it's not just the building footprint. It's if we have layers, so if we have a building height of 35 or even 50, right? 50, you can get into 3 or 4 stories. And yeah, absolutely. That magnifies that. So they can't, the parking minimum and the land that they have available to them, that restricts them. So a lot of times they can't really max out what is allowed in terms of their building square footage and building and the massing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'll wrap this up in saying that the lot coverage component where we were trying to wrap up building footprint with parking, it was kind of like, it was perhaps overreaching a little bit because we already have a parking ratio component that's restricting how much building and square footage of building can be actually used because you got to match that parking requirement. If we don't like the outcome, and case in point, this is looking at a restaurant drive-in situation with a parking ratio of 1 to 66, one parking space for every 66 square feet. Or the way the code reads it, 15 parking spaces for every 1,000 square feet. So it's the most onerous, right? In every other situation, we're talking about like a ratio of 1 parking space for every 250 or 300 or 400 square feet. So there's a little bit more play there that would come into being probably green in other cases, but this is giving you the most, extreme setting. So I'll leave this was just saying, if we wanted to be assured that we would have more pervious space, maybe the quickest thing we could do in code would be to change the open space requirement minimum and increase that, or the landscaping.
My major concern when we were talking about this before is that we don't overload the storm drains or under capacity, the detention pond, so that we're not flushing all this water down Monument Creek and creating damage downstream.
100%. So just one other aspect of this is to look at that landscape component and say, is 10 enough? Maybe we need to push it to 15 or 20 and make that a minimum of that. And what that will do is it will impact how much parking they can put on. It might force them to just be to the minimum parking. It might cause too much of a take, not meaning that in a legal sense, but taking too much land for green space that is needed to make the functionality of the commercial property viable, getting the customers through, whatnot. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Okay, cool. Signs.
All right, signs, go to the next one. So we regulate signs, there's standards, design, there's installation, all of that. They have to go through a permit process. And I'm gonna let them talk about freedom of speech, but some of the things you should know, if you go one more.
Yes.
So we have, if you look in the code, they give you samples of what the different signs are. There's some definitions of the signs. There's signs for commercial, there's signs for residential. The one thing you should know is your code does not allow signs in the right of way. So there's no banner signs, temporary, like you see the signs like, we'll buy your house for $500. No signs are allowed in the right of way per your current code. And then I'm going to turn it over to Bob as to how signs are regulated as far as content, not content.
It's 8:36, just so you know.
Yes.
How long are we gonna go?
That's a good question. So I
11?
what are you saying? Wow.
Who said that? Who's that?
I don't know. She'll.
This is a quick.
Signs you can't
We'll get to
regulate.
how long.
Yeah.
No, the basic requirement now for signs is if you have to read the sign to know whether it's permitted or not, that restriction is unconstitutional. Because it's restricting based on the content. And content is subject to free speech. So we can regulate on all other kinds of reasons, but not based on the content. So size, shade, location, et cetera, we can regulate on that.
You can't regulate on vile language?
If you have to read the sign to know whether it's permitted or not, you can't regulate it with some very limited exceptions. And they do go to very extreme language. So there's still the ability to regulate. Not sure I'm gonna get the terminology right, but if it's based on sexual activity,
Protected class.
nudity and some of that stuff, you can regulate, and it's very, very, very limited. So when I'm talking about sexual activity, you can't regulate a sign that speaks to LGBTQ plus. Not on any of that, but if you've got a sign that is showing people having sex, you could regulate that.
And is it legal to have off-site advertising,
Off-premise signs.
So,
off-premise, yeah?
yeah, that's been subject to some very recent Supreme Court activity after the Supreme Court case that said if you have to read it, it's not permitted. And the Supreme Court said off-site, on-site, that's okay. You don't really have to read it to know whether it's allowed. I think that's a little bit of a stretch, but that's what they said.
Right.
And then the other area that I think comes into play here in Monument that we always have to be a little careful of, on any of the state highways, especially I-25, we have to comply with state statute. Even though you're home rule for matters of local and municipal concern, not matters of statewide interest. And that's an issue of statewide interest when it comes to their state highway. So we have to follow state law that's intended to comply with Federal Highway Act stuff. and not jeopardize state highway funding. Mayor.
So if you have a giant golden arches on the property that stands 50 feet in the air, can we not become a community of signs that have to be 10 feet or lower?
You can regulate height.
Hang on, but the golden arches in our town happen to be on the interstate. At least from a display perspective, you can see it from a mile away.
Yeah.
Right? Can we, if it's on their property and not right away for the CDOT, can we regulate that height?
So if the highway's out of the picture, yes, you could. You might have to allow a period to amortize some value before you say out of here.
Right.
But you absolutely could.
I've got.
I don't know all the requirements relative to the highway, whether it's a zone. I know it's at least adjacent properties. So whether, maybe you guys know is.
Yeah, if it's adjacent, you have to send it to the state and the state has to review it.
And.
They can be more owners, yeah, but they,
Okay.
as long as we can't be more owners than them, they can be more owners.
So it's possible that those golden arches could remain even if we had enacted sign height limitations within the town, not adjacent to 25.
That's right. But we.
You want it done?
Well, it's just, I had people ask me over the weekend about how to recapture some of the small town feel. And I used to live in Cary, North Carolina, which doesn't have an interstate running through it, but they had a small sign or a sign ordinance.
Yep.
Nothing was allowed above the ground. So when you look for the golden arches, you were literally having to look at the ground to figure out where to find them.
Now, your code, if you go on, you do allow pylon signs and
Yes.
and they are based on the distance from the interstate. So you can have them within a certain distance. So you would want to first correct your code.
Yeah.
And then go back to
The
it.
pylon sign is the one at the bottom left with the two posts.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, we could look at whether we would have to allow that, but, if it wasn't for the interstate, absolutely. We could bring that down.
And the only other thing, yeah, I'll add about signs is sometimes murals can be considered signs. So if you have a dog care and you paint dogs being washed on the side of your house, in some cases, that's considered a sign and not allowed as well.
Well, Inglewood had a head shop in the town with Alice in Wonderland murals on the side and they didn't like it. And they took it to court and went to Supreme Court and they lost.
Yeah.
And so the only way they could regulate that after that was to say signs can be so many square feet on that property and that was where it ended.
It's a fun one. So signs, the last part of your code is definitions. So if ever you're looking through and you're like, what does this mean? Go to your definitions, because that's where staff and other planners will start. What does your single family actually mean? What do you mean by retail? What do you mean by front yard? Those are your definitions, and that's where most of the time you start there and then you go to other places.
Our glossary is insufficient.
Yes.
Have we been updating this based on recent legislation that's passed? That would maybe change the definitions. Are we keeping up on that? I mean, this,
Well, for instance, the family childcare, when some of them come and they're of that kind of importance, I believe staff is, but there's also just a running list.
There's a running list. It's codified, so it requires an ordinance. This gets to the point of, there was a comment made in planning commission during a VOA review saying, do we have to have everything here go through an ordinance, or are there some things we can do administratively, editorially, internally? And staff's response to that was, look, we're trying to be building trust here with the two dioceses, and until we've established that trust at a professional level where you trust us, we will bring the smallest and largest of changes to code, including definitions, to you as an ordinance for you to give us guidance. That was the latest thing we said. So to your question, we can and we will, but we don't want to overwhelm council either with, there are a very long list.
I would say things that are passed through state legislation or Congress. I don't think you need the bodies to approve changes to the definitions because they've been done by bodies that overrule us. But if you were inclined to change the definition yourself, I think that's where the bodies get involved.
Yeah, it's part of the charter, too, that we accept the Berlin state, so.
Right, the charter says we have to abide by state and federal guidelines, so I don't have a problem personally with if the glossary, if the definitions are being changed by another body that overrides us, by all means, copy paste.
Thank you.
I would only say, just give us a heads up, hey, in the last 6 months, we've updated per congressional state action.
Yeah, I think our intention will be that as we make changes incrementally, maybe hopefully even at a meeting by meeting basis or monthly by monthly basis, we'll try to provide you with an update of anything we're doing.
Okay.
So that you have understanding of that. Does that make sense?
Yep.
You do it more than 6 months.
Yeah,
It's a code
That needs
provision, it has to be approved by council.
right.
Okay, so we'd have to change the code first.
That's right.
Okay, I
Because-
mean, the charter sort of. It's not implied, it's implied that the charter accepts what happens at the state and federal level.
Not really.
It recognizes that you follow
Right.
Right.
state, federal law to the extent state law applies.
Okay, well, I'm fine with this defining it better.
Yeah, so maybe the next step is defining further in code that process. So that we can make it less onerous on you all and let us help you.
Sure.
Okay, so the next question is, how much longer do you want to go? So we'll know what we want to jump to.
Does everybody want to go through the rest of the packet now, or do you want to schedule another one of these in the next 3 months?
Another one of these in the next 3 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I'm getting a lot out of it.
Yeah, it's a great discussion.
Yeah, I like the discussion. I'm getting a lot out of it. I'm learning a lot, so I would prefer,
We can do that.
Okay, so before you go, I see you're packed up already. One of the things we did do at the beginning was introduce ourselves.
oh, yeah.
And I thought about it 10 minutes in, I'm like, well, I'm not interrupting them because they were on a roll.
Right.
So, I'm Mitch LaKind, I'm mayor.
Greg Collins, Planning Commission.
Laura Chronic, council member,
Steve King. Also.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Yeah.
Chad Smith, Planning Commission.
Any hours, planning commission.
Kathy Green, Planning Commission.
Marco Fiorito Council.
Sean Zerville, Planning Commission.
Ray Hagan, Planning Commission.
And Martin Trio, Planning Commission.
Who are we? So we're missing 2 members from the council. I don't think is the Kimple coming?
Mr. Kimball has been on.
Okay, so Ken Kimble is online. He's council member. Jim Romanola was unable to be online. He's partying in Florida or something, or working, I have no idea. But he's council member. Is there anybody from the planning commission that didn't make it?
We're all here.
All of them are awesome.
Cool.
I would like to see us do something more frequent.
Yeah.
Even if it's not necessarily this structured, we have to work together and we have to build trust with one another. And the only way we're going to do that is if we start to get to know each other. So we need to find ways to figure out what we can meet about in public, right? And start building that relationship. So this was a good first step. So I appreciate town staff for putting this
Yeah,
together.
thank you.
Yeah, welcome. And welcome back, Sheila, being part of the week. And thank you, Bob, for driving down and we are so yeah, we're some
I
really
get IT, sir, but.
and Will, if you have not all met Will, I think everybody's met Will.
No.
He is our new director of IT.
Oh, I will.
Questions to the staff that put this together based on the presentation? Obviously, we've taken notes and you've got questions. The best way to do this is to throw the questions at them and they can then put together a Q&A and provide it back to all of us at once.
Yeah.
That way we're not violating any
Mhm.
secret meeting rules.
It would also help guide them in future trainings, like what are the common questions that keep coming up?
Mhm.
And I think I said to Mike before a lot of you got here, I would like to see a joint retreat for our 2 groups.
The town council has done them typically once a year. In past years, there's been travel involved. We went to glorious Westminster a couple of years ago. And then the most recent, retreats were right here. Not, you know, it wasn't bad, but it was different getting away. So if the planning commission feels like they would be receptive to a 1 or 2 night stay someplace, then we can work that into the budget numbers and figure out. Like,
You know, one of the things I was thinking of after you mentioned that was a lot of, somebody went to CML this year. And I think the CML is a great opportunity to mix two things. You can get training and stuff like that. We already paid for the hotel rooms. And you could spend one night to where you have a get together to where everybody's there.
yeah, CML was eye-opening, right? Especially when they started talking about processes, that how our boards work. One of the things that I passed on to staff and Bob is there's actually, a book written called Bob's Rules of Order. And it's different from Robert's Rules of Order. It wasn't this long.
But I selected that problem.
Yes. So this book is gonna be free for all of us to review, right? It's supposed to be coming out from CML in the form of a PDF. And within it, we can pick and choose the parts of Robert's rules that we want to implement as councils, as boards, right? So I've already gone through and made a bunch of notes, because our town clerk somehow got a copy even before CML, or at the time CML was released. She gave it to me to read. I've given it back to her already. I'm waiting for the digital copy. But it will allow us to get through our meetings as a business meeting and function the same. So we would basically all agree to how we want our rules to be. And then one note on that is we have submitted to Bob and Allison our town ethics manuals, right? This will be for all staff and councils and boards to have to comply with, right? Everybody will get a signature page. Staff will keep a copy of the signature saying that you agree not to do bad things and unethical things, and if you do, wet noodles for everybody, right? But that's what we've been doing, right, to help. And then we're moving, we're gonna start moving at a breakneck speed on the charter implementation, right? So charter implementation is gonna take a couple of years, gonna take a lot of money. We budgeted for it. And you will all probably see some of those changes in the form of approvals as they come through as it pertains to what planning commissions see on a more regular basis. All right, what I covered.
I have a plug. If anybody's interested, the APA Colorado, which is the American Planning Association, the Colorado chapter, their annual conference is at Cheyenne Mountain Resort. So it's a short drive, it's a Wednesday afternoon through Friday afternoon. So it's a good place. And Shola, it's the last week of September, and DOLA does a one-on-one training as part of it. But there's sessions for that, so if you're interested in planning, so it's not.
Yeah, and to the point that CML, if you all haven't signed up for a CML account, the way to do it is with a town email. So we can talk about how if the planning commissioners want a town email, we can do it without a full-blown office license, right? And then they can use the town, because you have to use a municipal email address. And then you can sign up and you get a bunch of free classes with it. You can download documents for free. Or if you're so inclined that you want to pay for something crazy, like one of those big crazy books that they publish, you can do that too, but you have to pay for that. But if you all want, for the PC folks, if you want town email
I
address.
just got a link to join CML from you guys.
Oh.
I joined it, but I don't think it took a different email.
Okay.
I think it's already registered under somebody else's email than Tom.
Oh, all right, well, that's cool. So maybe it's under clerk.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that.
Okay, cool. If there's more information, and you'll get notification of the next conference, which is in Loveland.
Woo-hoo!
Glorious Loveland,
Can you send me a note on
and
conference or something
it's
else?
3 or 4 days?
Yeah.
3 or 4 days. And
I don't know what kind of facilities they have up there. It's not gonna be the same as the Great Wolf Lodge, that's for sure.
No.
Or the games.
Yeah, it was the Galen.
Yeah, what that cost, you know?
Probably $1,200 to play.
A person?
Grace family, hotel.
Per person.
Yeah.
Okay,
That's not.
so,
For me, I drove it.
oh, yeah, that's your fault. If you go to the CML website and you look at the conference, logistics, and you have desire to attend, I would make it known sooner to town staff, like let Mike know. Sooner, so that, especially since we're in budget season. That way we can make sure that dollar amount is available to cover the travel and food.
It's every June, right?
Is it June? The last one was June, wasn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It's
Usually the second week, I think. Yes, second week.
It's probably on the website.
So, yeah,
It is. It's already.
if everybody wanted to go, it'd be around $16,000-$16,000 added to the budget. So,
Then we would have.
not that much money. Yeah, we'd have to probably reserve a room to have
Yeah,
something and then meals.
or we just go to a
So I'd
restaurant.
say
We
probably
can-
40 grand.
You can bring your friend from Texas who likes taking everybody out for dinner and. And she's working with the town, right?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah. Who's the woman that's working
there.
Yeah, you were there. Who's the woman that is working with us?
The two, we talked about with, the EDC company, Buxton.
Yeah.
She's no longer great job.
What?
No. She went out with a bunch of other guys, started their own firm.
Oh, no, he was there too, right?
Yeah, they started their own firm.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Anyway, lots of fun, good camaraderie, good chance for us all to get to know each other. Outside the scope.
Lots of information.
Yeah, great info. So anyway, thank you all for being here and I'm looking forward to setting up the next stage so we can finish this packet. So,
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Will.
John Will.
I did, just did.
Good. All right, good, thank you so much.